right, welcome back to another edition of the Mintcast. This show is made possible by supporters like you as we face shadow banning on many platforms and the crackdown on independent anti-war voices intensifies. We ask you to support us by helping with our yearly funding drive on Indiegogo. Things have started well, but we need your help to survive and thrive. Now, every day, the war in Ukraine continues to take lives as the senseless bloodshed continues. Now, the latest news is from Washington is that the Biden administration is going to send cluster munitions to the country, a weapon that's banned in more than 100 nations today. My guest today is a tireless peace activist who has recently returned from Ukraine. Medea Benjamin is the co-founder of the anti-war group Code Pink and is here to talk about war, US government policy, and how to change it. Medea, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the show.
Well, I'm a great fan of yours, Alan, so it's a real honor to be on with you.
Well, the pleasure's all mine. So you recently returned from a journey into war-torn Ukraine. Could you just start by telling us why you were there and what your impressions of the place were?
I was in Europe for a conference in Austria in June that was a summit for peace in Ukraine. And we had representatives of 32 different countries there. It was a terrific gathering, although I must say the Ukrainian ambassador to Austria tried to nix the whole thing by putting pressure on the venues that were hosting us, forcing us to scramble at the last minute to find new places to hold the conference, to hold our press conference, and getting the press primed to talk about us as Putin supporters instead of peace lovers. And that really planted the idea for me that I should travel to some more of the countries in Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe, to see what the atmosphere was like for people who were advocating for a ceasefire and negotiations. And so I traveled to a number of Eastern European countries, including Poland, Slovakia, talked to people from Romania, Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, and really found a very troubling sense that people had of being afraid for their jobs if they talked about peace, losing their jobs as journalists, fearing their positions at universities, and a general sense that we are scared to speak out on this issue. And that's of great concern. Given that I was in Poland, I thought it would be good to go over to Ukraine and went there on a short visit and stayed only in the western part of Ukraine, which is supposed to be the safe part. Unfortunately, it's not all that safe. The night we got there, there was an air raid. People forced into the bomb shelters as a Russian drone hit a police/intelligence building. And soon after we left, Russian bombs that hit a residential neighborhood. But in any case, the impression I got talking to a number of people in Ukraine is that they're being fed a daily diet, both on the media and from their own politicians, that this war is going in their favor. That this war is winnable, meaning they can get back Crimea, and they should. They can get back every inch of Donbas, and they should. So I feel that for many of them, they were really divorced from the reality of the fighting and Russia's ability to keep this battle going. And of course, with every death of a Ukrainian, more hatred against the Russians is instilled. And so we found that there were even stores that had signs on their windows saying the language of the oppressor will not be tolerated here. People talked about Russians as garbage. They didn't want to hear the language. They didn't want any books, any music, anything that talked about Russian culture. So there is a tremendous discrimination even against those Ukrainians who are from the East, who are ethnic Russians and Russian speakers, who are having a hard time in Western Ukraine. But in general, I would say, people are suffering tremendously. We visited the cemeteries. We visited the daily funerals that were taking places in the churches, saw the mothers and the wives and the children weeping over their dead loved ones, and realized, I would say, reinforced my feeling that this war must end because of all the suffering that the Ukrainians are going through, and that whether the Ukrainians in the western part that I talked with understood it or not, this is not a war that's going to be won on the battlefield. And so the sooner we can get to peace talks, the better.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, in the West, we can read the figures about how many refugees have been created and the speculative figures about who has died and how many buildings have been destroyed. But ultimately, we don't really get that sense of dislocation and destruction without people like you telling us about it. And one of the worst things about this, listening to you, it does sound like there's an awful lot of reactionary forces being ignited all across Europe, actually, and it does sort of pertain to a very dark future for Europe. One of the darkest chapters of the war might yet be to come. It might come years in advance because the big news out of Washington recently has been that the Biden administration has decided to send cluster munitions, a weapon banned by over 100 nations, although not Russia, the United States, or Ukraine. I know Code Pink is actively organizing against this decision from President Biden. Could you tell us what cluster munitions are and why you are so against this?
Well, the world came together in 2008 to ban cluster munitions for a real reason, and that is because of all the unsuspecting children, the farmers who stepped on these and whose limbs are blown off. I mean, the terrible, terrible consequences that happen years and years after the fighting has ended. And we see this in Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. We see it in Afghanistan. We see it in Lebanon, where the Israelis dumped so many cluster munitions in southern Lebanon. It is literally all over the world where these munitions have been used. The results are horrific in terms of civilians not just being killed, but being maimed for life. And that's why the world said this is an abhorrent weapon. We will not tolerate it being used. And there are 123 countries that have banned it, including many that are part of the NATO alliance. And so for Biden to come out unilaterally and say, well, I'm going to disregard this, and it's a national security interest in the United States to be sending these cluster munitions to Ukraine, is absolutely ridiculous and should be denounced by not only people inside the United States and in his own party, and we were glad to see that 19 Democrats did that, but by all of these NATO countries that are members of this ban, that have signed on to it, and should be standing up to the United States and saying, no, we don't want you to send those munitions. So we have not given up this fight yet. We just put out a petition as Code Pink, and we're calling on not only members of the U.S. government, but of these NATO countries to speak out. And we really believe that this is just an example of the desperation of the Biden administration to want to see some success in the Ukraine counteroffensive, which isn't going anywhere. And so I think it is important that we use this decision by Biden to build up the opposition, not only to this particularly horrific weapon, but to the war itself. Because if Biden is willing to violate this international ban, what will be the next line that he crosses? Will it be nuclear weapons?
Well, we can only pray not. Yeah, I think there were reports coming out before of Russia using cluster munitions, and people were rightly outraged at this. I believe even in 2014, the Embassy of Ukraine denounced the use of cluster munitions on its Facebook page, in fact. And the reason is that if you use these things, these bombs fall in sparsely populated areas or perhaps heavily populated areas. And a lot of them don't go off immediately. They look like toys. People pick them up. They don't know what they are. They think they're trash or whatever. And years later, people will be getting maimed and even killed by these things. So, yeah, we'll never know the true death toll of this war. And even if the war stopped today, there will be people dying in the future because of it. And that's one of the reasons why we really have to work for peace. And you've been following this war closer than almost anybody. In fact, co-wrote the book War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict. What do you think a just peace would look like here, and how could we get to it?
Well, I think that has been outlined many times before, whether we talk about the Minsk agreements and giving autonomy to the Donbas region, giving them a chance to have internationally supervised referenda, the same for Crimea. The neutrality of Ukraine, I think, is a very central issue, and this has come up in the NATO summit that has just taken place, and it shows that despite the rhetoric that NATO is so united, there are tremendous divisions within NATO precisely about this issue of whether Ukraine should get NATO membership. It's ironic that now it's the Biden administration, because back in 2008, it was the US that pushed at the summit in Bucharest that NATO extend membership to Ukraine. And now it's the US administration that is saying, well, let's hold back on this. This is a red line for Russia. So indeed, I think that neutrality is a very, very important point there. While some would say that Ukraine has the right to be within the alliance and the umbrella of NATO, others would say that we have to recognize the security concerns of Russia that has Russians have been warning about this now for decades. In fact, in the 2008 summit, Putin said that it was a direct threat to Russia to have Ukraine be part of NATO. So I think a lot of these issues of neutrality, self-determination for the people in the Donbas region and Crimea have been outlined. For me, the big question is, how do you push all the sides to the negotiating table? And since I live in the United States, the big issue for me is, how do I push my own government to stop stymieing the possibilities of peace talks, whether it was ignoring the Russian overtures right before the invasion in December of 2021, whether it was encouraging Ukraine not to sign on to the mediation that was happening in late March, early April with the Turkish government, or whether it was the dismissing of peace initiatives by so many different entities, from the Pope to the Chinese to the 6 African heads of states, or the president of Brazil. The US has pushed these aside in favor of continuing the war. So I think it's important for those of us in countries that are part of NATO to be pushing our governments to recognize that moving to the negotiating table is actually saving the lives of Ukrainians.
And so, do you think that is the United States goal, basically, or NATO's goal more generally, to bleed Russia until the last Ukrainian?
Well, certainly we heard the words of the Secretary of Defense of the United States when Secretary Austin, when he said that we had to weaken Russia. And we've heard this said by many a representative of the US government in Congress, saying that it was a very good way for the United States to weaken our adversary, Russia, without having any US troops be killed in the process. I would say that much of what the US had hoped to do has backfired. For example, the tremendous sanctions on Russia that they thought was going to tank the ruble early on has not done that, but those sanctions have backfired and are hurting businesses in Europe, are hurting people as far away as in villages in Africa that are suffering from the increased price of wheat and the increased price of energy. And so the effects of this war are being felt all around the world. Whether the US and the West thinks it's a good idea to keep bleeding Russia, the reality for the global community is that it's a good idea to stop this war.
Yeah, just one more reason why getting to the negotiating table is absolutely paramount. We never really think about people in, for example, Africa or Asia who are really struggling with increased food prices, increased fuel prices. We hear a lot about it in Europe, and that's absolutely clear with energy prices going through the roof in the winter, people freezing, people worrying about how to heat their homes or having to choose between food and electricity. These are the sorts of casualties of the war that a lot of the time we don't think about. In terms of NATO and Ukraine, do you think NATO really wants Ukraine in there, or are they holding it over Russia like some sort of sword of Damocles? Are they just playing Ukrainians for the long game here?
Well, NATO is now 32 countries, and I think there is no unanimity. I think that certainly Poland and the Baltic countries want to see Ukraine within NATO, but other countries don't. We see the position that the US and Germany has taken of giving this very, very vague offer to be able to join NATO once the conditions are right and there's agreement among the allies. I mean, that's like almost less than what was offered to them back in 2008. And it's interesting that Zelensky himself, who was so angry about the way that Ukraine was treated at this NATO summit, said that it would be used as a bargaining chip. And indeed, I think that's what the more powerful countries within NATO want to see, because this should be one of the issues that comes up in the negotiations. And now that NATO has left that possibility open, I think it is actually positive in terms of the longer term conditions that could be put on the table for negotiation. And let's remember that Zelensky himself was open to and even accepted the fact that Ukraine would have to be a neutral country when negotiations were going on early in the war. He told his people, our dream of belonging to NATO is something that we will have to defer, and that in the name of peace in our country, we would have to give up on that dream. So, this is something that Zelensky will have to use as hopefully when peace talks do begin and compromises are made, he will have to sell this to his own people. But I think that there are many things in an eventual compromise that could be positioned to the Ukrainian people as a win for them, just as Putin will have to try to dig out any compromises and see them as a win for Russia. While the war is a lose, lose, lose for everybody, negotiations will have to be put in a different light for their respective countries to accept them.
Well, you say it's lose-lose for everybody. I can think of one group of individuals or corporations that might actually be gaining something from it, and that's the defense industry. There was recently a study that came out from the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, and they found that think tanks that are funded by the weapons industry, that means the usual suspects like Boeing, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, and Raytheon, absolutely dominate the discussion in our corporate media over in the West. They found, I believe, something like 85% of all of the think tanks that are the go-to source for expert analysis on the war in Ukraine were actually getting funded by specifically the organizations that are making billions upon billions of dollars out of this conflict. Do you have any thoughts on that, and how hard is it for people like you to get your message into the mainstream?
Well, first of all, yes, I should correct that lose, lose, lose. It's not just these think tanks, but it's, of course, the weapons manufacturers and the energy companies that have seen their profits go through the roof when the U.S. oil and gas companies have replaced the sanctioned Russian energy companies. So there are some companies and some people that do profit from war. But you're bringing up this issue about the think tanks that I think is so critical to talk about, because it does color what is the narrative that the people hear. What is the narrative that's on TV? What are the opinion pieces we hear? And who are the experts that are quoted in article after article? And when you see in this study that so many of them are taking money from either directly from governments like the US government, or directly from the Pentagon, a part of the government, or from the weapons contractors, it is quite remarkable that we call this a free media, because it's not. And what it means is that other voices have a very difficult time being heard. I haven't been able in a year and a half, and having published a very well-respected book, been able to get an op-ed piece in a major US newspaper. We submit and get rejection after rejection. I haven't been able to be on mainstream television where I used to in the past be able to be on there when I wrote books. And this is true for many other people. It means that there is a very insidious kind of censorship going on. And yet, Alan, I am quite amazed that despite this narrative that we hear from these paid for by weapons company think tanks, despite the narrative we hear from the Biden administration and the Democrats in Congress who have been cowed and silenced into having some opposition, except for something like cluster bombs when it was just over the pale and 19 of them had to speak out, despite the fact that the vast majority of Republicans in the United States, except for a small minority on the right, are in favor of the Biden administration's policies and only criticize it for not sending more weapons more quickly. Despite all that, you see in the opinion polls a growing questioning of the war in Ukraine and the Western support for it, a growing desire to see peace talks happening. And so I think that translates into a fear by the Biden administration that this war will drag on into the presidential elections and will affect them. When you hear Donald Trump saying, I will solve this in 24 hours if I'm elected, because I'll call my good friends Zelensky and Putin and we will hammer out some kind of solution. Or when you see Ron DeSantis, the very right-wing Republican who says he's in favor of a ceasefire, in the Democratic Party, you see Robert Kennedy, who is saying that the NATO expansion played a tremendous role in provoking this war and that we have to find solutions at the negotiating table, or whether you see the new Green Party candidate, Cornel West, with a very deep, profound explanation of this war. This is opening up a lot of space for those of us who haven't had that space before. And I'm hoping that we can use this to build a real peace movement. That's why the meeting I was at in Austria was so important. When 32 different countries got together, we called for a global day, a global week of actions, September 30th to October 8th. And I hope we can really start doubling down on building a peace movement that will try to push for negotiations in Ukraine, that will stop this push for a war with China, and will start to focus on how dangerous NATO itself is. And the fact that NATO is going to be meeting in its next summit next year in Washington, D.C., gives us a good opportunity to start building the opposition to NATO itself, not as a defensive alliance, but as an aggressive, dangerous military alliance.
Well, you said so much there. I don't know which direction I'd like to go in. I guess I'll say you touched on the Republicans there voicing their opposition, or at least rhetorically, to this war. Yet when President Trump was in office, he carried out a number of provocative actions towards Russia, which I think you actually detailed some of this in your book, War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict. So my sense is that you probably think if Trump, DeSantis, or another Republican were in there, perhaps the war would be continuing in the same way.
Absolutely. I wouldn't trust them for a second because of their history and saying one thing and doing something else. I mention them to say that I think they're smart politicians and know which way the wind is blowing, and they recognize that this is a positive opinion to have now for the public. But no, I would think that they would be even if they wanted to, they would be pressured by the forces of what some call the deep state or the military industrial complex to continue the war, which is why I think the only way to really end this war is to build support from the bottom up so that politicians, no matter what party they're with, feel the pressure.
And what do you think about Cornel West and his position on war? How do you feel about his third party presidential run?
I'm very excited that Cornel West has entered into this race. He still obviously has to win the Green Party nomination, which doesn't happen until August. But I think there's a lot of excitement about his candidacy because he's so respected as a very deep thinker and somebody who, for many, many decades, has shown his commitment to issues of fighting racism, fighting poverty, and fighting war. I've been arrested with Cornel West several times against the wars. He was there with us at the demonstrations against the war in Iraq. He has a very consistent message. So I think it's great having him in the running, and the fact that he will have an ability, at least through the media interest in his campaign, to reach large numbers of Americans with a very different message than they're hearing right now.
Yeah, totally agree. Switching topics slightly then, President Biden has recently appointed neoconservative figure Elliott Abrams to the United States Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy. I know that Code Pink has strongly opposed this appointment. Why is that? What is wrong with Abrams, in your opinion?
What isn't wrong with Abrams? I mean, Abrams is the anti-diplomat. Abrams is responsible for so much of the horrific U.S. policies in Latin America, more recently in Venezuela, in his opposition to U.S. having negotiations with Iran. I mean, he is the epitome of the neocon U.S. hegemony and the rest of the world be damned. And so I thought it was a satire piece when I saw that he was nominated for this diplomatic commission. I must say I'd never heard of this diplomatic commission. So on the positive side, it doesn't seem like it's a post that will have much clout. And the Biden people are saying, well, we had to nominate a Republican because a couple of the people on the commission have to be Republican. Well, they certainly didn't have to nominate Elliott Abrams. They could have and should have nixed him from the beginning. So I think it's just one more example of how depraved this administration can be when it comes to foreign policy issues. And we will continue our campaign to shame Biden for having nominated Elliott Abrams and trying to get more and more people to join us in saying that he could not be on any commission that has anything to do with diplomacy.
Yeah, I guess Elliott Abrams, for me, is the face of the Reagan administration's dirty war in the 1980s. You know, throughout this time, he supported horrible dictators and genocidaires like, for instance, the Guatemalan president Efrain Rios Montt, who was later convicted of genocide and crimes against humanity for his actions. And yet, throughout his worst, darkest period, Abrams was standing behind him, claiming that he had brought considerable progress on human rights in Guatemala and that the US should be rewarding and encouraging people like Efrain Rios Montt. Abrams famously lied to Congress about his role in the Iran-Contra scandal, whereby the United States was selling weapons to Iran and using the proceeds to fund death squads across Central America, something that Abrams himself was doing. He was whitewashing massacres, as many people have seen that clip of Ilhan Omar grilling him about the El Mozote massacre of 1981, which Abrams was trying to whitewash. And of course, even in recent times, he's been involved in trying to promote stunts to overthrow the Venezuelan government as well. So this guy is like the absolute neocon par excellence, and it is really extraordinary to see the Democrats embracing him.
Well, absolutely. We at Code Pink put out a list of why it's so horrific that he would even be mentioned in the same sentence as diplomacy, and brought up, as you say, the issues of the infamous defense of Rios Montt in Guatemala, the denying of the Mazote massacre, the shameful way that he has supported Israel, which of course is very much the same way that the Biden administration does. His involvement in the Iran-Contra scandal, his involvement in the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi and the support of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, trying to pull the U.S. out of the Iran nuclear deal. And then, as you say, his support, he became the special representative for Venezuela, and used his position to support a coup, to quash diplomatic talks, to increase the brutal sanctions that have hurt the ordinary Venezuelan people. And so, yes, we think that it is just a crime itself. In fact, he should be held for war crimes and not serve in any position where he can influence U.S. policy anymore.
Absolutely. And sticking with Latin America, I know another policy Code Pink has really focused on is Cuba, and specifically the US's economic war against it. What are US policies doing to the island, and what's your position on it?
I've never seen things so bad in Cuba as I have today. And it really is painful to see how the Biden administration, instead of following in the footsteps of the Obama administration when he was vice president, and when there was a normalization of relations that led to a win-win situation where Cuban economy was improving, where Americans could travel to Cuba. Instead, the Trump administration came in, wiped all of that out, imposed hundreds of new sanctions, and the Biden administration has basically followed with the Trump administration on this during a time when Cuba is still trying to recover from the pandemic, with the tourist industry wiped out as a result of that, and is putting so many screws on the Cuban people. The only thing that the Biden administration cares about is that this brutal U.S. policy has led to a new wave of migration of Cubans leaving the country in search of better economic conditions. And this immigration issue is one that the Biden administration cares about. But otherwise, for the administration, it's been a policy of trying to recover some seats and votes in southern Florida, which have gone solidly Republican, and instead disregarding the well-being of the Cuban people, and even following Trump's ridiculous putting of Cuba on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. It is so insane to say that Cuba sponsors terrorism. The reasoning that the U.S. had was that there were members of the rebel group, the ELN from Colombia, that were in Cuba, that the last Colombian government wanted to extradite. This Colombian government does not want to extradite. In fact, they are thankful to the Cubans for mediating a peace process. Cuba is a victim of terrorism, has been, with its civilian airliner blown up, with hotels blown up, with right-wing Cubans many times from the United States conducting acts of terrorism against the Cuban government. But the one other thing, Alan, that I wanted to mention that I find so shameful that the U.S. government is doing is trying to destroy the most beautiful program that Cuba has, which is the doctor program that would send brigades of doctors all over the world to help when there were earthquakes, floods, pandemics, you name it. And the Biden administration, thanks to right-wing Cuban American Bob Menendez, have characterized this as modern-day slavery, because the Cubans go with contracts from their government and they don't get the full salary. Part of their money goes back to the Cuban government to fund their free healthcare system. And more than that, the US government has strong-armed countries around the world to not accept these Cuban brigades. And so that used to be a source of income as well for the Cuban government, and that has been drying up in recent years. So these are some examples of why you go into pharmacies in Cuba right now and you have a great healthcare system, but you can't find the medicines, or the shelves are bare and people have to stand on long lines to get food. This economic sanctions is a form of warfare. It's a form of collective punishment, and it needs to be changed.
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, it's very disappointing for many to see that the Biden administration didn't really follow in Obama's footsteps. But I always wondered that that might have just been Obama doing what he had to, because, of course, in the early 2010s, there was this big leftist anti-imperial shift across Latin America, and these countries were organizing together. And they were threatening to leave the Organization of American States. They set up their own organizations in parallel, one called CELAC, which was the Community of Latin American and Caribbean Nations, which encompassed every country in the Western Hemisphere except the United States and Canada, who were purposely barred from joining. And so I feel like a lot of this sort of move by Obama was really an effort to placate the Latin American countries and try to stop them really going in a much more sort of independent line. And so Obama was kind of forced into that. But of course, by the time Biden gets into office, things have changed, and he doesn't really feel that need to talk in a sort of more good neighbor policy way. And so the ideas about closing Guantanamo Bay, well, that's just a distant memory in a lot of people's minds, even though it was one of Obama's really big policy goals that he wanted to achieve. And of course, as you said, Cuba really doesn't export much because of the blockade on the country. But one of the things it can export is its human capital, its incredible medical achievements over the last few decades. And even though people claim that these doctors are actually basically victims of human trafficking, I've spoken to a lot of them, and the program is very, very popular. It's one of the most important and popular things that people can do with their time, because for many Cubans, it's very difficult to see the world, but you can actually travel, and you also get quite a good wage as well. And so Cubans who return to Cuba often have a lot of money, especially foreign money, which they can use to buy a lot of goods and services which are just out of reach for ordinary Cubans. So far from being victims of human trafficking, this is one of the most popular programs in Cuba altogether.
Yeah, I would just comment that if indeed Obama changed course because pressure from Latin America, you would think that Biden would feel that same pressure, because there is this second wave of progressive governments throughout Latin America. Biden had his flopped Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles, where governments boycotted or came with a very strong message that you don't get to pick and choose, because he didn't invite Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. And of course, there's the vote at the United Nations that happens every year that you would think would shame any U.S. administration, when the entire world, except for the U.S. and Israel, vote against the U.S. policy towards Cuba. I would say that one of the factors that influenced the Biden administration was certainly the pressure internationally. Another factor was the business community that was quite organized during that time and had a lot of influence, including a very active Republican senator who helped to organize the business community. We don't have that now, and part of that is because Cuba is so poor right now. It doesn't have a lot of money that it could spend on agricultural products in the United States or other things. Now, one would think that the travel industry, like the cruise industry, would lobby heavily, because people love to go to Cuba on the cruises. When they opened that up during Obama's time, it was a big moneymaker for that industry. But the U.S. administrations have placed tremendous, big multi-million-dollar fines on those cruise industries. And so they have been cowed. So while there is now a lot of pressure coming from Latin America to to take Cuba off the terrorist list, we don't have the same configuration of forces. And unfortunately, the Cuban Americans who have benefited from this policy and get tax dollars, millions of tax dollars, have created really their own business out of this uh, hardline policy towards Cuba. They have a strong voice in Congress. And in fact, just this week, they had meetings in Congress with a number of the Cuban American Congress people. And their voices are very strong, which only means that those of us who want to see a change of policy have to keep organizing, which we are doing, and make sure there are other voices that they hear in Congress and in the White House.
Yeah, I think it really would be amiss to have you on the show without you telling us a bit more about Code Pink. We've referenced it a few times. What is your organization? What is your organization all about? And crucially, how can viewers and listeners get involved with you?
Well, we started out over 20 years ago now, thinking that we would just organize to stop the war in Iraq. We would be successful and we would all go back to our other work. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. We organized. The Biden administration that time didn't listen to the millions of people out in the street or the millions of people around the world who were saying, don't invade Iraq. Our name, Code Pink, comes from the Bush administration's color-coded alert that it used to be. There was a yellow, a orange, a red alert, which was designed to keep people in a state of fear. Like today is a code orange day. We had no idea what you were supposed to do, but it was to make people live in constant fear of another terrorist attack. So we created a Code Pink to say there's another way to deal with the world and deal with those attacks as a crime against humanity, going after the individuals who attacked us, but not using it as an excuse to attack other nations. So since then, we have been not only opposed to U.S. interventions overseas, but we've been opposed to militarism and the way that the Pentagon sucks up so much of our funds. Now it's almost $1 trillion that's going to the Pentagon that takes money away from all of the needed social services and the infrastructure projects and addressing the issues of the climate. We see the climate crisis all over the world. And here in the United States, we just see the state of Vermont flooded. We see the wildfires going crazy in so many parts of our country. And yet we're putting money into a war in Ukraine. We're putting money into confronting China. And we're constantly putting more and more money to feed this beast of the military contractors. And so Code Pink really wants to move us from a war economy to a peace economy. And we are part of a coalition of groups in this country that see the need for putting people and the climate over the Pentagon.
Great. And how can people get involved?
So people can join us. In fact, we've called for a summer of peace, and we have lots of exciting, simple or more complicated actions that people can take, from putting up signs that we have printed in your windows to holding talks and inviting speakers. And you can join us at codepink.org. And we're trying to make peace cool again. And we also are part of a coalition called Peace in Ukraine, over 100 groups. And we have many groups in the US and overseas who are part of that. And you can go to that at peaceinukraine.org.
Now, we've been talking a lot about Ukraine, but I think before we finish here, I think I do want to get your opinion on another potential war, one which I think might be one of the defining stories of the 21st century. You've hinted at it before. But there's also not just this Russian attack, but we've also got the US building up its forces in the Pacific, trying to strangle Beijing's economic rise. You've got a campaign called China is Not Our Enemy. Why is it called that? And what do you think about the US saber rattling against Beijing?
Well, we feel that saber rattling is, again, trying to justify militarization, It's building up for a insane confrontation with China, and it's also led to a lot of anti-Asian hate here in the United States. And so our campaign, China is not our enemy, is to try to counter that, saying the Chinese people are our friends. We have to work with the Chinese government to counter the climate crisis. We should learn from China and how they are able to pull millions and millions of people out of poverty, which is quite extraordinary, something we have not been able to do here in the United States. And so it's a very exciting campaign that looks at ways that we can and must cooperate with people in China. And that's why we have many aspects to this campaign that show the benefits of cooperation, show the benefits of learning from each other. And we also related to the case of Ukraine of showing the benefits of China playing a role as a mediator. You know, I don't like the governments of Saudi Arabia or Iran, and yet I was delighted to see China play the role of mediation to bring those two countries together and to help them to normalize relations, which has a very positive effect on the entire Middle East. When the Chinese put forward their peace proposal for Ukraine, we thought, well, you know, this is a great way for the United States to then respond, not by saying, oh, the Chinese could never be mediators, they're friends with Russia, but by actually looking at the proposal and say, we agree with number 1357, we don't agree with 246, to come together, the US and China, to say, how can we use our leverage on Putin and on Zelensky to move to the negotiating table? So there are so many reasons why we can and must work together with China instead of allowing the China bashers to drag us into a war with a major, major superpower. And the other thing I want to say, Alan, about that is that the American people have to learn the reality, which is that China is in a much better position globally because it hasn't used its military might. It's used its economic power. It's built up the BRICS, for example, that now represent a greater portion of the global domestic product than the G7 countries do. It's built up the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which actually is a very, very strong economic alliance. Counter that to, for example, NATO, which is just a military warfare alliance. And we see the de-dollarization efforts that have gained strength, ironically, given the war in Ukraine and the sanctions on Russia. So there is a world right now that is now multipolar, whether the U.S. People in power want to recognize it or not. And that gives us more and more reason to look at China as a friend rather than as an enemy.
Definitely. I often wonder what the world would look like if the West actually decided to work with China on issues such as climate justice and, you know, just trying to escape the worst of catastrophic climate change. I think we'd be in a much better position, certainly much better than ringing China with just a line of 300 plus military bases. And unfortunately, we see senators and media figures, a lot of them who express skepticism about the war of Ukraine. It's specifically because they're saying China is the real threat and we should be putting all our eggs in the anti-China basket, which is really unfortunate, which is why we need people like you and organizations like Code Pink to do all of the hard work for us.
Yeah, and that brings us back to the issue of NATO, because NATO has really been beefing up their Asia-Pacific, quote, partnership with Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, and Japan, precisely to build up NATO as a warfare against China. And so when we talk about our opposition to NATO, it is really because not only is NATO so intimately involved in this war in Ukraine and unfortunately continuing the war in Ukraine, but also because it already does have its sights set on China. And so for those of us in the West, educating people about the importance of countering NATO. And as we look forward to a future, as you mentioned, how nice it would be if we were able to cooperate with China. I think a dissolution of NATO is actually in the benefit of world peace.
Absolutely. And I think I speak for everyone listening when we say we're very grateful to Code Pink for all the work they do.
Well, thank you so much. I'm very grateful to Mint Press, and it's been a pleasure having a chance to talk to you.
Thank you very much. Medea Benjamin, where can people follow you in your work?
At codepink.org, or they can Google me. I write about every 2 weeks an article that's in a number of different publications, including your great publication.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
All right, that was Medea Benjamin here on the Mintcast. Just a quick shout out, we're doing our annual funding drive right now at Mint Press. Please, if you're in a financial position to support us, we need all the help we can get because we are sponsored by viewers and listeners like you. So if you are in an economic position, do go to Indiegogo. The link will be down in the description below, and give anything you can. Thank you very much for listening to us today.